Guten Morgen, Jenny hier. Ihr schaut den Einmischen-Podcast, hier wird Politik betreut. Und wenn ihr die heutige Folge unterstützen wollt, liked, teilt und abonniert diesen YouTube-Kanal. Andere Möglichkeiten findet ihr in den Shownotes, Steady, PayPal, Überweisung oder meine allseits beliebte Wunschliste gefüllt mit Büchern und Dingen, die wirklich Spaß machen. Und in diesem Sinne entlasse ich euch in die heutige Folge. Habt viel Spaß, gebt mir Feedback, kommentiert. Ich würde mich sehr freuen. Bis bald. Hello, dear listeners and maybe watchers. My guest today is from the Department of History from the University of Cambridge. And we want to talk about her book, Statelessness, A Modern History. And in German, it's called Staatenlosigkeit, Eine moderne Geschichte. It was published by the Hamburger Edition, and it is available in print form for 40 euros in German. Dear listeners, you will find everything to this book in the show notes. There is a digital edition as well. You can buy this as well, but I always encourage you to buy the books in paper because it's really great. Yeah, and the Hamburger Edition is making high quality books in any regard. So I'm really happy to finally talk with Mira Siegelberg. Hello, Mira.
Hi, nice to be here.
Is there anything you want to tell my listeners about yourself and your work field?
So I am a historian of political thought, mostly focused on the history of international political thought. So the history of ideas about the world of politics that we tend to describe as international politics, the history of states and the interaction between states and the different entities, individuals, corporations, states, non-state entities that together make up the world of the international. And I mostly focus on more modern period, 19th, 20th century into the 21st century. And I have been working as a historian of political thought at the University of Cambridge. I actually just started a new position at the New School for Social Research in New York in the politics department. And in keeping with my research interests, I'm directing the Zollberg Institute for the Study of Migration and Mobility. So my past work, which we'll be talking about today on statelessness, but also my future work, which is concerned with how we reason and argue about migration and borders and the different disciplines that we've inherited, law, philosophy, the social sciences, to come up with arguments about how to govern borders, whether to govern them, and the various kind of political questions surrounding those issues and how they're framed by our inherited scholarly disciplines. And I'm happy to talk more about that or just get into the book.
I have a lot of questions for your book, but just now I had this thought as a historian, writing and thinking about those those things that happened in the 19th and 20th century. Do you think history is repeating itself right now, or is the history of the past catching up with our present politics?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there's value to historical investigation because I think there's value to understanding where the ideas and institutions that continue to shape our politics come from. That's not always part of our contemporary political discourse.
Mm.
But I think better historical understanding works to clarify what we're doing, what we're not doing, what we're arguing about, the terms we use, the institutions that usually we've inherited. So in the book about statelessness that we're going to be talking about, I'm interested in the architecture of the international order that dictates what it means to be a stateless person, what it means to be a refugee, the legal frameworks that defines what it means to seek asylum, the institutions that govern those legal frameworks, where they come from, and that understanding something about where they come from allows us to grapple with what they are, their limitations. And in my current research, I go further back into the 19th century. We'll talk about the book on statelessness is more focused on, it really pivots around the First World War, the 20th century and the mid 20th century, sort of the transition from the era of the First World War through the Second World War. And what I'm currently working on is kind of moving backwards, because I wrote this first book on that reaches back in time, but is mostly interested in the 20th century and its legacies. But I just started to wonder more about the later 19th century moment when the world of regulated national borders take shape. And that's the world that we live in now. So it's not that, I mean, history does, you could say it repeats, but it's more that these moments of creation and formation have lasting implications and legacies, and they often get forgotten. And I think they can. I hope that that better understanding kind of can help us kind of navigate through difficult moments. Not necessarily, but at least there's a possibility.
Yeah, I always hope that especially politicians learn from history. But then again, I live in the present, and the present of the last 10 years is making me really cynical. Right now, I don't know if you follow German or European politics so intensely, but right now we will have a right-wing government in Austria for the first time then since the Second World War. And my current election cycle started a little early, and the conservative front runner for chancellor, also the head of government, is talking about getting rid of German citizenship for some people who have another passport as well. And that's so semi-legal. We would have to fight over it in our legal system. But it is something that would have not been allowed 10 years ago in the political discourse, because he would have been more like a right-wing party member. In fact, right-wing parties nearly were forbidden for exactly what he is giving into the political discourse right now. And I'm a little bit concerned about the way this political landscape is developing right now, and especially frustrated that you see those old historical lessons and it seems they are forgotten. I mean, Donald Trump, I don't know how to describe my feelings about that, but it's really frustrating and frightening, the world stage right now. And the individual national government in Europe right now is also frightening.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm wary of applying direct historical analogies.
Yeah.
Right now is exactly like the 1920s. Nothing is exactly like anything else. But I can't help but depend on the knowledge that we have and the banisters that we have to make sense of the world around us. And this moment does seem to resonate with other moments where there's been, backlash against migrants and a narrowing of the definitions of citizenship and belonging. At the same time that the policies have to move around the architectures that have already been set up. So, one of the reasons you might be able to deprive someone of citizenship is to say, well, they have another citizenship already. It's not rendering that person stateless, right? Because if the international community is organized around the prevention of statelessness, and we can talk about whether it actually is, but there is some structure in place to prevent statelessness, because there is an idea that to be a person without a nationality isn't just a problem for the individual, but it is collectively, that's not something that the international community should accept. But it allows countries to potentially strip someone of their nationality because they, at least nominally in name, have some other passport or some other kind of identification. So that both tells us about the cultural moment, the culture and politics of the moment, which are, is where there is some acceptance of those types of policies, or at least that they're, the people who want to enact them are being voted into office, and how history has shaped the possibilities for those types of practices.
Maybe we can find our way
we
to
can
your
get
book
into the details
now, because I think this question is a good starting point. What does it mean to be stateless? Because as we talked about it, even if in Germany there is a way to get rid of one citizenship, dual citizenship allows someone to remain protected by another state. But your book tells this story about real statelessness in the time between the First World War and the times after. What does it mean to be stateless? What happens to those people?
So the book, it's about the concept of statelessness, and I always like to acknowledge that the term has a legal definition, and we can talk about that legal definition and how it came about, but that the term always remains much more broadly evocative. Someone might formally have citizenship somewhere, but the concept still evokes a general sense of displacement, homelessness, acute vulnerability, danger. But it is also a formal legal concept that evolves from the end of the First World War to the period after the Second World War, with the establishment of the United Nations and international conventions that define what it means to be a refugee, what it means to be a stateless person in international legal terms. And what I'm interested in is how, first of all, why the term statelessness assumes a particular significance after the First World War. The notion of not belonging in a political sense precedes the First World War. You can even find the term stateless in various literatures and in fiction, in legal literature. And there is a kind of important concept in German language, which might still be used, of Heimatlosen, of just being kind of homeless. And you could use that in a domestic sense, or it also is used in the 18th and in the 19th century in a more political sense of not having a homeland, of not belonging politically. But I think what's particularly important in the First World War is that you have the breakup of these major empires, which had contained a certain kind of political belonging, political subjectivity, in the extensive Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire. There are imperial forms of citizenship and subjecthood that these political spaces encompassed. And in the course of the First World War, they get broken up and new independent countries emerge. I mean, that's a much more complicated story, but that's a brief way of describing that story of the, one way of it's been described by historians as the fragmentation of sovereignty, but also the creation of new kinds of sovereignty. But in that context, it's not as though ideas of what the state is, what it means to belong to one, were all just given. They were being invented and remade in that setting. And so the rise of mass numbers of people who begin to be identified and to identify themselves as people without states, as staatenlosen, as, the term appears in various languages as stateless, is an indication that something new has happened. So it's not just the continuation of the same kind of political displacement or homelessness, that it connects in a deep way to the question of, well, what does it mean to have a state, to be a state? What is a state? What defines its boundaries? When does it begin? And how do we determine who's on the inside of the state and who's on the outside, and who gets to decide? So the rise of many people who can be identified as stateless and begin to be identified by new organizations like the League of Nations, which is established at the end of the First World War and in the aftermath of the First World War, that the concept of statelessness and the experience of statelessness is inseparable at that moment from many of the big questions that were at play about who gets to decide what a state is. Is it at the international level? Is it a matter of international law? Is it a matter of military conquest and success? Is it about revolution? And what is modern citizenship? So one of the things I became interested in is how the concept of statelessness was so deeply embedded in the central questions of the nature of politics, the nature of the political, the nature of citizenship and belonging, and that a lot of those debates tend to dissipate over time, even as the plight of the stateless, the plight of those who don't belong to any state, becomes more acute and scales upwards. By the end of by the Second World War and the end of the Second World War, many more people could be described as stateless than after World War I. But somehow it becomes disentangled and separated out from those fundamental questions about the formation of statehood, of international order, of law, and that's one of the big stories that I'm trying to trace. But yeah.
How does the identification with a nation or a state differentiate from the legal aspects? Were there ever any form of thoughts in law as well that you can be stateless even if you identify with a nation?
That's a great question. So there's the notion of nationality has had two meanings. I mean, from certainly from the 19th the 19th century and perhaps even earlier, but certainly in the 19th century, you got the notion of a legal concept of nationality, which is that an individual is recognized as the subject of a particular state, and that doesn't involve a question about that person's identity and maybe the more kind of substantial ways that we might think about identity or how someone identifies in an affective way or in relation to modern nationalism. But there's also a concept that evolves from the 19th century onwards of nationality as belonging in a deeper sense, in a more kind of connective, deeper way of connecting to other to one's group. And that's an ambiguity that persists in the concept of nationality. But in an international legal sense, nationality doesn't necessarily connect to how one feels about the place where one lives, whether you identify with your state or with your nation. So I could go on, but maybe you want to follow up.
Yeah, there was a case in your book about this German who, at the time of the Second World War, also bought himself a citizenship in Liechtenstein. And as I understand it from your book, the court said he only bought it. He didn't identify with this state, and that's the justification to then see him as a German citizen and not as a Liechtenstein citizen. So that's how I come to this question, because at some point it seems to be some sort of legal aspect.
Yes. So the case that you're referring to is commonly known as Nottebohm versus Guatemala. It appears before the International Court of Justice, which is an international institution that's established after the Second World War to adjudicate international legal disputes. The case is from roughly 1955. And as you say, it involves a man named Friedrich Nottebohm, who was born subject of the German Empire, made his way to Guatemala, established a very prosperous business there with his brothers. And it's kind of a fascinating case. It's not the only one, but it is pretty intricate. He's treated as an enemy alien, as someone who is as a German citizen during the Second World War, and the question is, when he tries to get out of both being a German citizen, he doesn't want to be a citizen of Guatemala either. He purchases citizenship in Liechtenstein. So he pays a certain amount of money to become a national of Liechtenstein. He doesn't live there for very long, if at all. The content of his citizenship derives from paying for it. And the question that the court takes up is whether this should be recognized as real, whether it should be recognized as a real form of nationality. And the majority decision determines that it's not real, because it doesn't reflect his actual bonds. It's not a genuine link. That's the language of the case. It doesn't reflect a genuine link. And I take the case to be significant because it is the first time significantly that international law defines nationality in these substantive affective terms. It's not enough for a state to legally authorize your citizenship in a formal way, and then that can be recognized as such. It's the first time that international law states that citizenship has to reflect something that's more substantial, a more fundamental connection between the individual and the state that they claim to be part of. And that shift I take to be important because it's not a claim about what citizenship should be, how international law should understand it, but that legal forms of belonging, legal in the sense of kind of formal, where the question of how one identifies or how the state sees you, or this kind of genuine link, where it's just about the question of the kind of formal legal connection between the individual and the state, had been this kind of essential way of reasoning about the nature of sovereignty and the relationship between individuals and states, and that's a very significant shift in the transformation of international order when international law begins to say citizenship has to reflect something more. Nationality, actually, not just citizenship. Nationality as the international legal connection between individuals and states has to reflect something deeper than a formal recognition. So that's why that case kind of comes at the tail end of the book. It bookends earlier discussions of the question about whether one belongs just by the mere fact that you are a legal agent somewhere, that you're able to appear in a court, that you're able to sue, that you're able to have a kind of legal identity somewhere, and that identity is sufficient to mark your belonging. So that's that. Thank you for bringing that up, because that is a kind of key. That's a key part of the book.
Yes, and that's a German who got his ass kicked in court, and there's another case of a German, a Prussian in this case, called Max Stoeck, and his case are at the beginning of the book. And here I have two questions. The first is, does statelessness have good effects as well? Because usually when we talk about statelessness, it's always this term that's identified with something bad, because you are stateless, you have less rights, you are not protected, and you cannot travel, for example. But it looks like Max got good things out of his statelessness. Good for himself.
Yes, I mean the case of Max Stoeck it's the first chapter of the book. In my research, I saw a number of references to this legal case involving this was a person born in the late 19th century. He was a subject of Prussia, had received his permission to leave Prussia, because of course to leave your country at that time, to leave the German Empire required a kind of formal acceptance from the state that you could leave, mostly for reasons of conscription. And he went to seek his fortune in England. He lived in London, and seemed to have been a kind of inventor, and was involved in a business that an industry that produced lamps for mining. So an important kind of industrial figure, and didn't seek out British nationality or citizenship, because before the First World War, he clearly didn't seem to feel he needed to do that. He had left Germany. He had let go of his obligations and responsibilities of citizenship there, but had no need. He could happily reside and form a limited liability company, travel freely. That doesn't mean that in the late 19th century, everybody was able to travel freely, but there is an idea that there was this kind of pre-World War I moment where there was a certain kind of bourgeois, capitalist freedom to move, to participate in capitalism, and without having any national identification. You have a question.
Yes, it was this moment, especially in Europe, where you have this first spark of globalization, and not yet the moment of the national state, where there is where you need a passport to travel. The restriction to travel comes from how deep your pockets is.
Yes.
So and in the practically same moment, there is this catastrophic event. It's the First World War and everything that follows with this war and its destructions, and the development then of the national states as well.
I think historians are complicating that story of kind of this sharp divide between the Stefan Zweig world of security pre-World War I, where you could travel and reside where you wanted to, and you didn't have to think that much about nationality. And I mean, because it was heavily dependent both on your finances, but also your race, your ethnicity. I mean, that
Your gender.
your gender, the capacity to move was even in those late 19th century decades, beginning to be heavily regulated and governed. But for someone like Max Stoke, he didn't feel that. I mean, or at least from the standpoint of his personal life, his marriage, which comes through in the archives, his business dealings, his attendance at international conventions where different scientific and technological innovations were presented. He kind of was able to operate and live in that world of freer international interaction. And then all that changes with the outbreak of the war, when all non-nationals of Britain, all non-subjects of the British Empire, have to register as enemy aliens, and he is detained as an enemy alien. And that's the beginning of kind of the creation of this category of the enemy alien. He's detained in Alexandra Palace. I think there's some great pictures of, I think it was very difficult to be there, but there are pictures of German people playing chess, kind of occupying their time. And he was using legal means to try to get himself out and arguing that, in fact, he was not German. He was a stateless person. He had relinquished his citizenship of Germany. He had received his certificate indicating that the state had relinquished their hold on him. And because he had not yet attained citizenship in England and Britain, he was a citizen of nowhere. He was a stateless person. And so the case, I think, is significant because it's the first time that a court recognizes the statelessness as a legal condition, as a status. Countries and, I mean, international lawyers had entertained, what does it mean to be a stateless person? What is its significance in international law? Both from the negative side and the positive side. Can you claim individual sovereignty of an island that you find, as, statelessness, both in the sense of a stateless territory and a stateless individual who isn't claiming a property in the name of a particular country. But for a domestic court to recognize that this person had no citizenship anywhere was taken to be very significant in determining other cases like Stokes across the British Empire. And lawyers and courts and politicians were paying close attention to this case around the world because similar questions had come up throughout the war. And so that's why I start the book with the case, because it tries to locate the significance of this case in the World War I moment, but also in the longer history since the 18th century, when you begin to see debates about, is it possible to be a stateless person? Is it conceivable? If the world is organized into defined political entities, is the concept of statelessness a fiction, that only exists in literature, or is it something real that exists out in the world and is part of our legal and political landscape? So that's why the case opens with that book. But it wasn't. I didn't intend to start the book with a case from Germany and end with a case from Germany. But there probably are deep historical reasons.
Just works like this.
No, I think it relates to something about the history of migration and capitalism and the German Empire in the late 19th century. But I think that's a different story.
My first question was if this was a case of something positive coming out of statelessness, because I I'm not sure, but I don't think the British Empire could retain his property because he was stateless. He couldn't be punished for something another state did.
That's right. I mean, so for him, from a personal standpoint, from a kind of private law standpoint, his personal status, his property, he wasn't looking to make a political statement. He was looking to get back his life by claiming to be stateless and being recognized as such. And that is what happens to him, although he does end up moving back to Germany. I don't know if that's what the archives don't tell us if that's what he wanted to do. Maybe he wanted to stay in London. But from a personal standpoint, it allowed him to reclaim his property. It allowed him to get back some of his life, to get out of internment. But there's a deeper philosophical, political, legal question that arises from the case, which is this a good thing that we now have stateless people in the world, that this is now a kind of recognized legal phenomenon? Because fundamentally, to be a stateless person in a world that is organized around, call them states, call them kind of regulated territorial political entities, that can't be a good thing. Or is it? I mean, that becomes kind of a pivotal political and philosophical question in the interwar period, where many people are, understandably disenchanted with the state in the aftermath of, this catastrophe and incredible destruction. And the question of, well, what is a state? Who gets to found it? What defines its sovereignty becomes important. But so does the question of, can we get beyond it? Is this the kind of political community that has such a hold and a claim on us? And is there a way of kind of gaining a more cosmopolitan possibility, a post-national possibility? And does the rise of statelessness signal the beginning of that political potential? So those are some of the debates that kind of come out of that initial recognition.
What does it mean to be stateless versus being a refugee with a still valid citizenship of a state?
So if I'm going back to what I said at the beginning, when you say stateless, I think it evokes, you think of what we now define as a refugee, someone who's fleeing persecution or fleeing a terrible situation in their home country. Maybe they still formally have citizenship, maybe they don't, but you can think of statelessness as in this much more kind of capacious way. It matters historically that what happens after the Second World War is that there are debates about how to define statelessness in legal terms, how to define what it means to be a refugee in order to define state obligations towards those who are recognized as refugees. And there's some move to say, look, this is on a fluid spectrum, as you suggest. Even if you formally retain your connection, you still have a passport, you have no formal protection from your state. You're essentially stateless. Let's kind of have a much more capacious category, the kind of person that can claim entry to a new place because they are stateless in this wider sense. But what actually happens is that there's the overriding state interest after the war is to create much more defined separate categories. To say a refugee is someone who retains their nationality and faces persecution. Statelessness is something else. It's someone who has lost that legal connection to a state. And the narrowing of these categories has implications for state obligations and responsibilities if they agree to the terms of these conventions. So I think in kind of more colloquial, conventional usage, we think of this as a spectrum, that we're not limited by the legal categories, but in practice, the formation of the legal categories matters a lot to how you're defined. Whether you're defined as a refugee, whether you're defined as a stateless person. After the First World War, there was a wide spectrum, and it wasn't so kind of clearly delineated. There were those who had fled from the Bolshevik Revolution and its aftermath and were seeking residence, asylum elsewhere around the world. Are they refugees? Are they stateless? The question of defining their statelessness ended up being taken up in the League of Nations. Those from the Russian Empire were defined in international terms as stateless persons. They got Nansen passports because they no longer belonged. The claim was they no longer belonged to the entity that was the Russian Empire. But you can see how it provokes these kind of deep questions about, well, if you, let's say you haven't left Vienna, you've always been you lived in Vienna, but you used to be a subject of the Habsburg Empire and now have not kind of been able to claim citizenship in the post-World War I Austrian state. That's not a refugee in the sense that we usually understand it, of having to flee, of leaving somewhere. But that's a different kind of statelessness, a person who can't claim citizenship somewhere.
Because the state refuses you. The new
Yes,
state
because
doesn't want
you're
you.
not. No, and I suppose in some cases there are those who don't want to claim citizenship in the place where they live, or they would prefer a different kind of citizenship. Yeah.
In this time between the wars, the League of Nations, it seems, was trying to find a way to deal with statelessness, but didn't want to ruffle any feathers. Why was it so hard for the League of Nations to find a way to deal with stateless people?
So
And sorry, maybe for today as well, why is it always these international organizations who want to do something better, but always are stopped in some way by the national actors as well?
Okay, great. So the League was an organization founded by empires, by empire states. It's an international organization in that it's not a supranational organization. It's meant to coordinate the activities of different states, state governments, imperial governments. But because of its organization, because it created separate administrative agencies to handle big questions around the mandates, the organization of the kind of post, the breakup of, the governance of former imperial territories in the Middle East and the Pacific, because it was authorized to handle things like kind of big refugee crises. It looked like the beginnings of something like a supranational organization. And it contained the tensions of having a novel international civil service that were set up, were given the responsibility to think at a really big scale about administration and governance in a way that made some of those civil servants and made some people look to the League as something more than the sum of its parts in terms of kind of world government. But in practice, it was held together by distinct countries with distinct sovereignties, and it was not designed to undermine sovereignty. In fact, one of the things that the organization worked to do was to try to kind of establish the balance between the things that could be handled in an international administrative way beyond the state, beyond the constitutive states, in a way that could encourage peaceful relations, at least ostensibly. I mean, some would argue that it was organized in a way to promote the interests of the particular powerful empires that were at the heart of the organization. And at the same time, it also had to adjudicate and defend sovereignty. I mean, it wasn't kind of, meant to undermine it. It was meant to kind of police that boundary between the things that could be governed by an international organization and the things that were kind of set within the realm of kind of sovereign states. At the same time, they're in the midst of kind of working out what counts as a sovereign state. So that's kind of is part of the complexity, and the way they deal with the question of statelessness, what it means to be a stateless person, what kind of protections do stateless people get, should they get, who governs them, who represents their interests, touched on that on those very issues. And the Nansen passport was an innovative technology to provide people without national citizenship and their own kind of country passports to move about, to get work. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. A lot of the time when it worked, it was underwritten by other real political forces that were willing to recognize the passport as real. But at the same time, the League was very hesitant about recognizing a great variety of post-imperial subjects as stateless, in part because that put them in a position of adjudicating these big questions about, does the law of the Habsburg Empire persist in some way into the kind of sovereign new countries that have emerged out of the empire. Same with the Ottoman Empire. The League would get letters from people who were living in the country we now call modern Iraq, who were unsure of their political and legal status. Were they subjects of the British Mandatory regime? Were they subjects of the British Empire? Were they citizens of a new Iraqi state? So the League didn't want to put itself administratively in a position of adjudicating these kind of fundamental questions about where sovereignty lies and what it means. At the same time, they were necessarily involved in kind of creating that boundary by, but handled it very, very delicately. They didn't want to ruffle feathers, as you say. But in the way they were handling it, it reveals to us the kind of underlying politics of the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's something the UN is still battling today as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another great thought process in what you just said, because we live in a time where states are sometimes in a really big crisis. One can argue that Haiti is a failed state right now. Other states are in civil war or in war generally. So still those citizens are not stateless. So can you become stateless when your state is not functioning? Because I think this is something courts will have to recognize at some point for refugees as well. Especially in Germany, we will have this discussion about Syrian refugees. A lot of politicians say, so Assad is gone. You can go back home now, but the state is partly occupied by Turkey and Israel. And there's still this uncertainty with the new government, whatever will come out of it. So the state of the state is unclear. But still, these people are not stateless, according to German politicians. So at what point is the state of the state part of the discussion?
Yeah, I think that's the deepest, one of the deeper questions that we're dealing with at the moment, and it is undetermined. One of the features of the stabilization of the concept of sovereignty and statehood after the Second World War was to make the state something that could exist even without a lot of the kind of substantive features of I mean, it's the definition of statehood depends on material substantive features that kind of begin to be defined in the mid-20th century, going back from the 19th century, but formally defined in the 1930s, and then onwards. You need territory, you need a certain population. There are kind of real things that qualify a state as a state, but the weight is on formal recognition of statehood in an international sense, and it's hard to lose that status as a state. The most extreme example that I talk about in the book are countries where the territory has disappeared or is disappearing as a result of climate change. Then you get a kind of extreme case of what you're describing, where it's not just a non-functioning
it's
state,
just gone.
but that the fundamental material basis of territory is eroding or has disappeared. And then the question is, can a person really retain their formal identification if the state has disappeared in that kind of really material, territorial sense? But that I think you're right. That's on a spectrum with the question of, what about someone that comes from a country that is not functioning in a substantive way? And that's where you can have lawyers kind of use the materials that exist. They can use the Refugee Convention, they can use the Convention on Statelessness, they can use other kind of concepts from international law to try to reason through it. And we have these the basis for that kind of reasoning. But I think the big questions that have come up now is, are those sufficient? I mean, are those protective frameworks and regimes enough to address the nature of contemporary political challenges? Because the emphasis of the post-Second World period was in kind of settling and stabilizing the post-war international order. But it's being kind of thrown up and upended in various ways. And it seems unwise not to revisit the categories that were invented in that post-World War II moment for that moment right now. And I think one of the big projects that a lot of lawyers and creative political thinkers are taking up is kind of rethinking these regimes of protection in light of climate change, in light of political conflicts, and so that's a live subject. But what I hope I've contributed is some sense of the historical perspective on how we arrived at these resources that end up being the kind of basis for reasoning and analysis. Well, how do we define a refugee? How do we define a stateless person?
Thank you, Mira. Last thing, I always ask my guests if they have a message for my listeners.
Well, first, thank you for listening. Thank you for if you take the time to check out the book. I'll always plug for history and the history of political thought and ideas, for trying to kind of find our way through the present. Some of the concepts I talk about in the book feel arcane: legal personality, even sovereignty. But my perspective as a historian of political thought is that these are, grappling with the more conceptual and philosophical dimensions can ultimately produce, better thinking. But that's take up the charge to do that.
Okay, I can tell my listeners something good, because even how bad the view of the world is right now, we are not in the state like the 1930s. States cannot expel a person and make them stateless if they are not wanted. Like, for example, the Jews after the pogroms in Germany in 1938. So there's some development in human culture and international and national law. We are not starting at zero. We are already have some positive development. And we just need to develop from there something better, even if the times are pretty bad right now. But Mira, it was a pleasure to talk to you, and it was nice to think about those times where we started and where we are now is a great development. So even if we had to go through a lot of bad stuff.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you too, and I hope you have a nice day today.
Okay, you too. Thanks so much.